and welcome to Tilly Talks Trade. Tonight we are going across the world to a diverse and rich environment of Brazil. This country is rich in oranges, coffee, music and the expansive Amazon forests. Tonight we will cover globalization, economic and human development, cultural distance with Australia and the industry recommendations for Brazilian and Australian trade and investment. Globalization refers to the integration between different countries and economies and the increased impact of international influences in all aspects of life and economic activity. While currently the 8th largest economy in the world, Brazil was a latecomer to globalization. This was because of its very protective nature towards its industries, and it was very suspicious of foreign competitors. Neoliberal successor governments have attempted to integrate with the global economy, but the turbulent politics have hindered this process. Before globalization, Brazil had a large workforce and an abundance of natural resources. However, they just lack the technology to utilize these effectively and efficiently. Globalization allowed new technology to enter into Brazil and help them to be able to use these resources more efficiently and effectively. Furthermore, agriculture has grown thanks to a reduce in tariff rate and also caused Brazil to become the biggest producer of coffee and oranges. Globalization allowed the entrance of transnational corporations, which assisted in creating more stable income, improved education and skills, and investment in infrastructure, and helped to exploit their natural resources. Additionally, an increase in cheap labour led to a reduction in unemployment and an increase in GDP, as you can see here. Globalization in general created a democratization of knowledge, increased social networks, and sped up the exchange of information for Brazil. Global sporting connections also grew, and they were able to host the FIFA World Cup in 2014 and the 2016 Olympics. The BRICS nations, which Brazil is one of, grew at a faster rate than the developed nations between 2002 and 2013. This can also be seen as a result of this globalization, as economic globalization and entrepreneurship contributed to their growth and development. Alongside the economic growth, the Human Development Index of Brazil also increased. Between 1990 and 2000, there was a 1.14% growth from 0.61 to 0.684, and from 2000 to 2010, there was a 0.6% increase to 0.272. So you can see that with the increase in globalization at the start, there was this very fast increase in the Human Development Index, which then started to slow down while still increasing. While the net effect of globalization is likely to be positive in the long run, there are also risks involved, and these tend to be more prevalent right at the outset when the country starts to liberalize. Financial crises and contagion can arise due to international market imperfections such as herding, panics, boom-bust cycles, and the fluctuating nature of capital flows. For successful integration, economic fundamentals need to be and remain strong. Local markets need to be properly managed and supervised. For Brazil, globalization led to a 1999 financial crisis, which was caused by contagion. What happened was that as the financial crisis swept through Asia in 1997 and then Russia in 1998, investors that were pulling their investments from those countries also started to remove theirs from Brazil. So this is one of the downfalls of the globalization for Brazil. Additionally, there was a reduction in wages which led to a potential exploitation of workers in Brazil. However, it did still lead to an increased GDP overall, as can be seen here. While there are some issues initially with the globalization in Brazil, the positives outweigh the negatives and Brazil emerges as a winner due to globalization. The continued connections with global economy will continue to accelerate the productivity growth in Brazil, raising incomes and living standards. To continue our discussion of Brazil, we will hear from economic and human development expert Matt Sellars after the break. I have Matt here with me today, the economic and human development expert. Thanks so much for joining us on Tilly Talks Trade.
No worries, thanks for having me.
Now, what is it that you will be touching on today, Matt?
Okay, so I'll be going through both the economical and human development of Brazil and how these developmental factors would potentially influence an Australian firm if they were considering expanding into Brazil. So I'll start off. Brazil's steadily growing since the mid-1990s, where an agricultural boom of about 10 years, it quadrupled their value output. So this began their surge to becoming one of the largest net exporters of grain, beef, oil and iron ore. Despite this great agricultural boom though, it was quickly identified that maybe this reliance on the industry could potentially have a really negative impact if natural causes affected the output.
Wow, yeah. So how did they go about safeguarding their development in these areas?
Yeah, so as I think a lot of people know, they had the World Cup in 2014 and then the Olympic Games in 2016, both in Rio. And these two massive global events being confirmed there just meant such significant infrastructure upgrades and development, increasing jobs for the people of Rio and Brazil, and it brought in just such a large tourism opportunity for that country, not only for that time but continuing on from there. And they could really showcase the features of Brazil, like the Amazon, and it just kind of wasn't used enough before that.
Yeah, wow, really beautiful country.
Yeah, exactly. So from here, they've really made an effort to continue this growth in the tourism industry, and they've identified their infrastructure and manufacturing industries that really need to be improved as well. Yeah. So Rio actually is the only underground train line service in all of Brazil, and this country holds over 197 million people.
Oh wow, so a lot of room to grow there.
Exactly right. Right, yeah. But look, their country is being held back by high crime rates, taxes, corruption. They've got quite a large dominant monopoly business kind of mould there. But despite this, the country's really pressed hard to decrease poverty, where it's decreased extreme poverty from 23% down to 8% over a 10-year span.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, it's really, really good. So they've done this with bringing in policies to increase education, increasing adult participation in formal work, raising incomes, and they've really pushed hard on this scheme, the Bolsa Familia scheme. Pardon my Brazil, I don't think I said it quite correctly there, but basically this just sends money to the poorest families. So it sends cash based on them meeting certain criteria, so sending their children to school, completing immunisations, basically just making sure that the future is educated and ready to go into the workforce.
Wow, like a little money sticker chart.
Pretty much, yeah. It's really, really great. So they not only give the poverty-stricken families a chance at a better life in the immediate future, but again, safeguards their future through incentives of education, greater chances of finding work, and this will only improve their standard of living in future generations.
Great.
Yeah, so just continuing with that Human Development Index, so the numbers actually increased as you'd expect with all these great things that they're doing. So it went from the low 0.6s up to 0.759. So this is obviously hand in hand with the economic development of the country as well. And making these policies based on education is just going to see the next generation reap the benefits.
Absolutely fantastic. And from here, for an Australian firm thinking about coming into this sort of turbulent country, what aspects do you think that they should be focusing in?
Yeah, so look, personally for me, I think the economical development is of greater significance for an Australian firm trying to come into Brazil.
Yeah.
There's a lot of their human development, it's based on their own future in education, bringing people into the workforce, that's their own Brazilian people. And the fact that the development is in a positive direction, that's the human development, it's really opened the door for the economical development to just get larger and larger. So the opportunities presented with their poor infrastructure, like I was talking about before, that could be a great opportunity for some Australian manufacturing companies to try and come in and attempt to ride that push for better infrastructure, better manufacturing. And due to the great practices we've got in Australia, they could try and come in there, raise the standards and the regulations in Brazil as well, and really have a positive impact.
Sort of a good impact for both sides.
Yeah, exactly. So kind of a win-win situation for both. And obviously the agricultural industry still running high, as we talked about, but the way it seems like they're going is they're pretty content holding with what they have. So there's no real push to kind of continue it on and continue it increasing, although it is still doing well. So if I was a manufacturing firm, I'd be really keen to get into Brazil, but maybe agricultural, I would try and stay away as they're pretty well established and there's not a whole lot to kind of get more potential out of it.
Yeah, I did see that they are the largest exporter of oranges and coffee.
Exactly.
At the moment. Well, right. Wow. Thank you for that interesting little cap over there of Brazil. Thanks so much for coming on Tilly Talks Trade.
Thanks for having me.
Off in another trip, we're off to the Netherlands to dive deep into the Hofstede Institute to talk to our expert Carl Ramsay about a few theories.
Thanks, Till. I'm here at the Hofstede Institute where I'm going to talk about the importance of culture for a firm looking to enter a country while highlighting the cultural similarities and differences between Australia and Brazil. Under Hofstede's cultural dimensions, Australia and Brazil show a different approach to culture, with very different scores for each dimension, such as power distance, where Brazil scores quite highly with a 69 compared to Australia's lowly 36. This signifies that Brazil believes that there should be a clear hierarchy and that inequalities among different classes is acceptable, whereas in Australia it is much more relaxed and only has hierarchy as a means to an end, with managers relying heavily on employee input. This is further exemplified by the fact that in Brazil you are 71% more likely to experience a class divide than in Australia. Furthermore, Australia scores a 90 for individualism, which details the expectation that people are self-reliant and look after themselves and their immediate family in regards to getting a job or promoted. While Brazil scores a 38, depicting their strong ties with family, which prefers older members working to help younger members to get a job. This system also involves more trust and friendships in business compared to Australia, which might make it more difficult for an Australian firm to enter this market, as it is much different to how we do business. Another dimension where both countries differ is masculinity, where Australia scores a 61 while Brazil scores a 49. This isn't much of a difference, however it displays the winner-take-all attitude that Australian society has, whereas Brazil is more caring for others and you try not to stand out in the crowd. Hofstede's uncertainty avoidance dimension deals with controlling the future or let it happen kind of mentality. Australia scores a 51 for this, showing a slight anxiety when looking into the future, while Brazil scores a 76, which signifies the need for rules so as to structure life, and often they show their emotions in their body language, which is different in contrast to Australia, who is often a little more reserved. Long-term orientation is another dimension where both countries have differing scores, with Brazil having a score of 44, while Australia scores a lowly 21. This shows the propensity of Australians to want the absolute truth and to control societal change and cling to tradition, whereas Brazil follow this more loosely and based on their higher score. The last Hofstede dimension I'm going to talk about is indulgence, where Australia scores a 71 compared to Brazil's 59. This details the way that Australians may set aside more time in comparison to Brazil for leisure, and also they spend their money a bit more freely. Recent studies have shown the Hofstede's dimensions for each country have strong support, meaning we can judge these scores as accurate. The study also shows a link between countries in close proximity with each other. Although many in the contemporary world see Hofstede's work as outdated, another study has found that there is no reason to dismiss the scores in this way or see other frameworks as superior, meaning the scores recited earlier are an accurate representation of the cultural difference between Brazil and Australia. Since 1985, the political environment in Australia and Brazil have actually been quite similar, in that they both have 3 branches of government where the Prime Minister or President is also elected. However, Brazil is seen as a flawed democracy under the Democracy Index, with low rating in the functioning of government and political culture, whereas Australia posts quite highly in these categories. This may cause problems for firms looking to enter, as the government could potentially react negatively to a foreign firm or impose harsh taxes. Ultimately, the cultures of Brazil and Australia are becoming similar in some respects, with both having a well-structured education system and both running under a democracy. However, they are still very distinct in comparison to each other, and great care must be taken for a firm entering, as they must take into account the differing ways of managing, the importance of trust and building relationships, as well as their reliance on family. Thanks for having me.
We're now going to bring the discussion back home with our expert in Australian trade, Clara Gebauer, who is going to explore just what it is that Australia should be trying to trade and export to other countries. Clara, Clara, thanks so much for joining me in the studio today to talk all things Australian trade.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
It's great to have you. And while this segment focuses on Brazil, it's very important for us to have a look at Australia and those parts of the trade industry that it should focus on when trading internationally. Now, I'm curious, which industries do you think Australia should specialise in? And just how do you decide this?
That's a good point. I think we should dive into that first a bit. So how we actually look at it is based on the comparative advantage theory that was developed by Ricardo. So this theory states that the country should focus on producing that one good that it is most efficient at producing. So even if there is two goods that it's best at producing, it should only focus on that one that it's really most efficient in.
Right, to get the most out of the efficient production.
Exactly. So all the other products will be left to the other countries and they will then be traded.
Wow.
So yeah, what that means in turn is that if a country is not best at producing any good, it should focus on the one it is least inefficient in. So basically which relatively its own best product should produce.
Sure, its favourite product. Wow. And what comparative advantage do you think Australia has?
So here we can for sure say that Australia's comparative advantage lays in the industry of natural resources and specifically minerals.
Right.
So we see that actually Australia makes up more than 51% of the global exports of iron ore. So that already tells us that Australia is obviously best at producing that.
Yeah, wow, it's pretty amazing.
So yeah, that's actually like about 15% of the Australian exported goods is iron ore.
I guess we just got really lucky with some natural endowments there.
Exactly. So why we have this is, of course, for natural resources. We have those given here. So the physical resources definitely contribute to our natural endowments. Whereas then, of course, we also have those supporting industry with the labor, specific labor and engineering and so on and so forth.
Right.
But really, the lucky bit here is the natural resources.
Of course. Besides iron ore, are there any other materials that you think that Australia has a comparative advantage for?
Yes, actually in the same industry. So still talking about natural resources. We're also looking into coal here because Australia actually makes up for 36% of the global exports of coal as well.
Wow.
So we can say that that's also one that Australia is good at. But remember, for Ricardo always says, only focus on one product. So we'll stay with the iron ore for now.
True, and it might seem that we have already burnt up all of our coal anyway. Now, there's a big trend going on at the moment worldwide focusing on sustainability. How has that trend impacted these advantages that Australia has?
So good that you bring it up because it's really been a recent trend not only in that industry but worldwide. We see there's a lot more concern for environmentally friendly products, sustainability, also recycled materials and so on and so forth. So people say that this comparative advantage is kind of, they're debating whether it's a blessing or a curse. Of course, it's a blessing in the sense that it has really helped boost Australia's economy in the past, right? It's providing labor and so on and so forth. However, it can also become a curse in the future when we see that this trend is actually increasing, that iron ore or coal or any of those natural resources are not as popular anymore. So we don't know what's going to happen yet, but it's definitely a possibility that this comparative advantage for Australia is going to change in the future.
Right, and as we've seen with coal, I'm sure these natural resources, there's not an infinite amount of those in the ground, so we are possibly going to run out.
Yeah, so this is not stable.
Very scary. Well, thank you so much, Clara, for all your insights and for coming into the studio today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And thanks for being with us on Tilly Talks Trade. My next guest speaker is Camille Beltroy, a Brazilian politician. She is going to discuss trade in Brazil.
Thank you, Tilly. It truly is an honor to be able to speak to you in Australia from the jungles of Brazil. And what better place to speak of comparative advantage? So comparative advantage, as you guys know, can actually be quite a complex term. David Ricardo suggests that countries should focus on producing goods or services that come at a lower opportunity cost to them than that of their trade partners, but the advantage isn't always clear for every country. Comparative advantage basically insists that countries in international trade shouldn't attempt to produce all goods and services in which they are efficient, but only those in which they are most efficient in comparison with the other countries in which they trade with. Here in Brazil, the lines of comparative advantage are actually quite blurred. What I mean to say by this is that we don't have a good or service in which we produce more efficiently and at a lower opportunity cost than the countries in which we trade with. In fact, it hasn't been until the last decade that Brazil actually began to open its doors to new trade and began exporting more goods and services. You see, Brazil is the 9th largest economy in the world, but only the 22nd largest in regards to exporting and importing trade merchandise. This is mostly due because the government has a very increased taxation on importing and exporting, which has led to the very strong internal system of trade that Brazil has adopted. And the internal system of trade has worked throughout the years here, but as globalization is creeping around the corner, the country has to begin participating on a global scale in the trade world. The Brazilian government has recently adopted the active trade policy meant to begin Brazil's initial international investment and government procurement agreements, aiming to expand trade agreements and build ties with neighboring countries. It's these very trade agreements that have enabled Brazil to drastically increase their exportation rates as well as those of importation. And as you just heard your Australian expert Clara speak of natural resources being Australia's biggest export and area of comparative advantage, here in Brazil we specialize our export and comparative advantage in the same department. That is the Department of Natural Resources. And just like in Australia, it's the mineral iron ore that is Brazil's largest export and one of 2 goods of comparative advantage that we consider. I say this because, as you know, the world's true leader in iron ore is Australia, not Brazil, yet it is what we produce most efficiently and at the lowest opportunity cost in comparison to our trade partners. And as a country, we consider iron ore to be our good of comparative advantage. But even though truly Australia has the true comparative advantage on a global scale because they produce it not only more efficiently and on a larger scale, but also to a lower opportunity cost than their trading partners. Luckily for Brazil, Australia doesn't do its most significant trade deals with the same countries as we do, which is why we're able to consider iron ore our biggest and most significant good of comparative advantage. Now you may recall that I mentioned that iron ore is one of 2 goods that we consider when it comes to comparative advantage for Brazil. The other is because some like to argue that soybeans are Brazil's strongest point in comparative advantage, and while it is the country's 2nd largest export, this is not the case for many reasons. Brazil cannot effectively produce soybeans at a lower cost than the United States, which is the global leader for soybean exports. And this is because the United States has a very developed infrastructure, proper funding, as well as a multitude of trade partners that Brazil lacks. All of these are very crucial assets in the trading system, and this allows the U.S. to dominate the soybean trade and Brazil be hindered for lack of. So as you can see, comparative advantage is actually kind of complex when it comes to a country like Brazil, where we lack infrastructure and we are still developing, and we're only just involving ourselves in the international trade system more openly. So we have many things to improve upon before we can dominate the market. But it's been great to have me on the show, Tilly. I've had an amazing time, and I